Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to all the Collective Shout viewers and new friends and followers who are joining us this evening. This is another conversation, a follow-up from our first with Richie Hardcore. Tonight, I have Robert Jensen joining us, and we're discussing reimagining masculinity, conversations with men challenging porn culture. Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Daniel, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. I'm just going to brag about you a little bit before we kick things off, just give a little bit of an overview of your background before we jump into some of the questions. So for those who may not be familiar with Professor Robert Jensen, who was one of the academics at the University of Texas, Robert's background when he completed his PhD is in media ethics and law. And prior to that, he worked as a professional journalist. In your teaching at UT, you taught undergraduate and postgraduate courses in media law, ethics, politics until you retired in 2018. And obviously much of your writing and teaching, for those that are familiar with you, are critical approaches to media and power, and much of which focuses on analyzing pornography and the radical feminist critique of sexuality and men's violence. And now I hear that you spent a little bit of time focusing on ecology in your writing.
Yeah, I was lucky to have a lot of latitude to look at the world, write about what I wanted to. It was one of the great things about being a professor. And as you pointed out, you used the word power. That's what I realized eventually that what I was interested in is how power gets used. Men over women, white over non-white, rich over poor, Americans over everybody else in the rest of the world. And eventually thinking about that in ecological terms. How do human beings impose on the rest of the living world? And so sometimes people say, how do you make sense of your career? And to me, it makes perfect sense. How do we understand the abuse of power? It's very simple.
Yeah, it's such an important question, and something I think what I love about your writing, Robert, is how much you ask us to reflect personally on that rather than just being an external exercise, but looking at it within our own lives and what we participate in. Can I kick things off by asking, how did you find yourself becoming critical of pornography, both as a student and then obviously throughout your academic career?
Well, I always point out that I don't preach from on high about these things, that I have struggled, gone through a lot of change, much of it often very painful, and it puts me right in the place you're asking about. I was 30 years old. I'd been a journalist working in newspapers, with generally what in the US we would call kind of liberal political views. I thought I was, very conscious about race and gender. And then I went to graduate school, and I was lucky to meet some people there, especially some feminist scholars and feminist students I was in classes with. And I learned pretty quickly how much I didn't know about how the world really worked. And I got into the issue of pornography simply from a kind of legal perspective. I really wasn't a budding feminist. I was interested in the legal questions behind some of the critique of pornography. But once I started looking at the question itself and the social implications of pornography, I found myself pulled into not just a more expansive study of it in scholarly terms, but a more personal reflection on it. Because like most people, even old people like me who are pre-internet children, I had used pornography as a child, starting very young, the way boys would at that point find magazines and pass them around. I remember very distinctly sneaking into an X-rated theater. That was before Netflix and Pornhub, and you went to movies in the theater all the time. I remember as a young adult in my 20s struggling with this attraction to pornography, but then a very almost depressed reaction after using it. So I didn't know at the time, but I was not only interested intellectually in the issue of pornography and the law, I was trying to work out some of my own demons. And I was incredibly fortunate to find people who were going to help me do that, especially those women who really opened up not just the porn issue, but a whole different way of seeing the world. And it was transformative, not in a flash. I didn't wake up one day and say, oh, now I have a feminist analysis of pornography and I understand male dominance. No, it was like I said, really painful, because I had to come to terms not just with the failings of the culture, but with my own failings, and try to to rebuild from that.
Do you think that that is one of the hindrances that a lot of people, in particular men, find when grappling with this issue, is because it is so deeply personal? It's not just about a big, ugly corporate behemoth out there or some ugly politician out there, that it cuts down every human heart.
Yeah. I think that's exactly it. And listen, most of us don't want to look at the ugly side of our own lives. I mean, that's pretty, when I first started to read about racism and white supremacy, and I, thought, well, that's the bad white people. And then I had to start thinking about my own life and how I was raised and the assumptions I went into lots of situations with. The same thing around, gender questions. I always thought that the bad guys were, the rapists and the bullies, and you could identify them and you could place it all on them. And then you realize, oh wait, it's really not about good guys and bad guys. It's better to be a good guy than a bad guy. It's better not to engage in, angry, violent behavior. Obviously, I'm not saying there are no differences in the way we men are socialized and behave, but you really have to, as you put it so, I think, well, this cuts through every human heart, just like almost every human problem. It's hard to place it only in the other. It's in ourselves. It's not easy to face, but there's no other way to creating not only a better world, but a better self if you don't do that. That's what I learned through a lot of struggle.
Wonderful. What would you say is your argument for why other men should care about the reality of pornography and its harms, not only, selfish reasons for themselves, its impact, but on their relationships and also just the broader world? Like, why should men care?
Yeah. Well, I always say there's two arguments, an argument from justice and an argument from self-interest. The argument from justice is about the injuries visited upon girls and women in this culture. The routine violence, the control, the coercion. That is a reality of basically every woman's life in the society I live in. And I care about things like equality and dignity. And if I care about those things, it can't just be in the abstract. It has to be in some realistic way. And so I always say that if we are the people we tell ourselves we are, people with values, people with principles, people who care about justice, then we have to care about things like the routine sexual exploitation of women. Otherwise, we're lying to ourselves about who we are. That's the argument from justice. The argument from self-interest is to realize that while this system, visits these injuries on women and girls to a far greater degree than it does on men, living in a system of, male dominance comes with real limitations for us as well. And I had to sort through my own upbringing, some of my own fears that I grew up with and still had as a young adult when I finally confronted that. And then I realized, oh, this whole feminist thing just isn't for women, it's for me. I often tell a story about a male friend of mine who said, if you're here to save women, that is, if you want to get involved in this issue because you think you're the white knight going to ride in and save women, he said, we don't want you. We don't want you in this group. He said, because we won't be able to trust you. He said, you have to be in this to save your own life. And I'm pausing for two reasons. One is because that's a very powerful thing to realize. And also because the friend who told me that died, almost 10 years ago now. And he was such an important influence and such a beautiful person in my life that every time I think about him, I never know if I'm going to tear up because
I love that, Robert.
Because one man, in some ways, I learned from so many women, and there weren't that many men that contributed to that education. And he was the one man that I think without Jim's influence in my life, I probably wouldn't be the person I am. And so it's a reminder that it's great to have a rich, loving community, but sometimes just having one person who can tell you the truth and be decent to you can make all the difference in the world. So I think about that a lot, because when people say, well, it seems so overwhelming, how do you fight this? I just had a conversation on email with a new female friend about this. And I said, listen, if you are creating a positive change in the lives of the few young men you work with, you are so far ahead of the game. That's how it works. One decent person in your life can make all the difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'll take that moment before I jump to my next question to say that you've very much been that in my life, Robert, and no doubt countless others. Your books, your articles have left such a profound impact. And as you say, and I've never thought to use the language that your friend used, but you know how much it is about saving yourself. In humanizing women, you humanize yourself. And that is something that I completely, that's your language. I've stolen that from you, you know, and I'm so grateful for that. And I know that that's been part of my journey, is the more that I see the way that society and culture and mainstream media, and then obviously pornographic media, completely dehumanizes women. I recognize for me to be fully human, I have to reject all of that and reimagine another way. And I just want to thank you for your critiques. And I thank you so much that you've sat obviously at the feet of so many wonderful feminist, you know, writers who have influenced your thinking as well, and your humility in that space.
Well, I'm grateful for that. And that makes me feel good. But it is important to also recognize that I was working off of the insights of so many other people who came before. You know, often things crystallize in a moment and we think, oh, the people who said it in that moment are the people who came up with it. And that's almost never the case. It's hard even for me to identify all of the people who helped shape the way I came to think about this. Some are famous. Andrea Dworkin is the one I always mention, the great unfortunately late feminist writer who is probably the woman single-handedly most responsible for this critique we talk about and for changing my life through her writing. But people whose names are never known, people you met, worked with in you never know where that's going to come from. When we had our Zoom call earlier to prepare for this, I got off the call so grateful for having met you now and learning from you, because you're so much younger and in touch with a different kind of experience. I mean, you know, I'm proud of the work I've done, but I'm also aware of how it required others, and it still requires me to stay open to others. You know, there's nothing worse than somebody who thinks he's got it all figured out. And,
yeah,
and that was something Jim taught me also. You never have it all figured out.
Your favorite book that you wrote, or my favorite book of yours rather, that you wrote, Getting Off Pornography and the End of Masculinity. Can I ask, for people who may not be familiar with the book, why is pornography the end of masculinity?
Well, that title was a little ambiguous. By getting off, of course, the double entendre of sexual release, but also getting off pornography, quitting, separating yourself from that form of exploitation of women, can lead to the end of masculinity in the sense of giving up on some of the worst conceptions of masculinity. Obviously, I'm male, I'm a man, I embody a lot of things that, you know, we would call masculinity. But pornography for me was never just about the actual media product and how to stop using it, or how to analyze the harms it created for women and girls. It was also about opening up this larger question of, who am I? Do I want to be what the culture told me to be? You know, in crass terms, do I want to be the same kind of man my father was? Or do I want to be something different? And so part of that for me was realizing that before I can figure out what it means to be a man, I have to figure out what it means to be a decent human being, you know, free of all of those expectations. So that book came out in 2007. It's hard for me to remember almost. And I always want to point out that there's good news and bad news about that book. The bad news is the publisher went bankrupt, and so it's out of print. The good news is, because the publisher's bankrupt, I could put a PDF of it up on my website for free. So it's now available.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to direct people to that.
Yeah.
That's very kind.
If I may, one more, that book was really hard for me to write. For that book, I did a lot of research going to the pornography industry convention, which was really difficult. I watched actual video pornography for that book's research, which I hadn't done in a long time. And by the end of the research for that book, I felt broken. I felt overwhelmed. I was looking at pornography in a way that men who use it for sexual gratification don't tend to use it. I always say most men have never really seen pornography, and everybody laughs like, oh yeah, right. And I say, what I mean by that is when you're using pornography for sexual arousal and masturbation, you don't really see what it is, right? You're too caught up in your own pleasure response. But when you step back from that and actually look at it, it's very painful to see this is the world in which we live, in which the routine degradation of women and girls for male sexual pleasure is so routine that it's almost invisible. And at the end of the research for that book, I felt really broken. And I vowed I would never do another study like that, and I haven't, for my own sort of protection. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole again. It was really scary.
That's yeah, you've kind of left me speechless, even though I knew a lot of that. I think hearing it from you, in this format is confronting. And I think about my colleague, Melinda Tankard-Reese, with the book that she wrote, Big Porn Inc., and how much, that took it out of her to have to confront those topics. And I think, you make a distinction. And, I think a bit about people like Iris Murdoch and the notion of like seeing and beholding someone and what that does to us. And like when you actually stop and behold what pornography actually is and actually look upon that person and dignify them, it's hard. And I know for me that what you've touched on kind of mirrors or is the other side of the coin, in that like I don't just want to shame young men into not watching pornography, because I don't ultimately think that's going to win out in the end, but for them to so conceive of their own humanity and that of the women and girls that it's impossible for them to find arousal and pleasure in their degradation, in their dehumanization. And I guess that's my hope for this series and for the work that we're all committed to doing, is it just becomes, anathema for them in terms of how they conceive of sex and intimacy, relationships, and what it is to be a person.
Often those of us who critique pornography, we're told, a number of things, that we're prudes, we're sexually repressed, or that we're kind of scolds. We're always telling people, how to behave. And I want to emphasize, obviously, I've never met a single person in the anti-porn movement who was anti-sex. That's just a silly, label that it puts on. But I also do want to emphasize that I don't ever feel like I'm preaching from on high. There's a lot of debate about whether to think about problematic porn use as an addiction or not. And I'm going to leave that aside because I'm not a specialist in that. Certainly lots of men report an addictive-like behavior pattern with porn. They talk about wanting to quit and can't in the same way that a drug addict or an alcoholic would. And in some ways, whatever the science about addiction says, and I do think there's a good argument porn is addictive. In a sense, when you've stopped using porn, every day is probably like being an alcoholic who has stopped drinking. You have to wake up and say, today I'm not going to drink. And I am a long way from, regular porn use. It's way back in my history. But I still feel like every day I know I'm at risk. This culture makes it so easy to fall back into behaviors that in a moment will feel good. Right? There'll be this incredible, intense release, but then the self-loathing, the shame, the reality that you've just achieved sexual pleasure at the expense of women and girls, all of that floods back in. And I still have to tell myself that, not because I'm, afraid I'm going to, fall back into porn use, but because I'm aware of just how easy it is. This culture makes it so easy to do things that are destructive to others and self-destructive. And so anybody who's struggling, all I can say is, yeah, me too.
Yeah.
It is basically a lifelong struggle, but it's also a struggle that can be won.
That's right.
And that's the good news.
Thank you for your honesty, Robert. And I feel likewise, as much as I don't want to share my full story here. You know, whenever I do speak to boys, I tell them about being exposed to porn when I was 10 years old. And even though, like you said, you know, daily porn use is so far from my life, the one thing that I do make sure I get across to the boys when I speak to them is that, like, I'm not some saint, as you say, sitting up on high. I'm still negotiating the same culture as them, where pornography and sexualization and objectification is wall to wall landscaping our lives. And so it is, as you say, you're kind of committing to a bit of a, you know, a long pilgrimage in this current cultural terrain to negotiate it, and that there are no kind of heroes. And I really appreciate you saying that and recognizing that. But as you say, I think for me, it's worth it. It's so worth it. And there is something about, you know, going to bed at night with your conscience, at least to an extent, clean, because you're like, I'm living consistent with my values and wanting to orientate what my mind and body is for in a way that I see is, you know, rejecting those toxic stereotypes for men.
And I want to emphasize that the foundation of my work is a feminist critique of male violence and men's sexual exploitation of women. There's no getting around that. But this argument from self-interest isn't abstract or philosophical. I was just thinking as you were talking, if you live on a constant diet of junk food, there's reasons junk food is attractive. Salt, sugar, and fat. Salt, sugar, and fat work, right? They're great.
It's a good time.
But and I ate my share of junk food when I was younger. But when I tried to start eating a different way and cooking for myself, I realized there's this whole world of flavor out there beyond salt, sugar, and fat. It doesn't mean that salt, sugar, and fat stop tasting good. They still taste as good as they ever did. It's just that my ability to cook and taste has changed for the better. And every once in a while, I still like a little salt, sugar, and fat, sure. But it reorients you to a wider palette. And the same thing sexually. And I'm not going to speak, you know, bluntly, because I don't think it's appropriate. But when you take yourself out of that very addictive-like, destructive relationship to pornography, then you start to feel differently in your own body. And you realize that with a partner, you can feel differently. And there's a wider range of experiences. Now, again, it's great, it's beautiful. It's also scary as hell if you grew up, you know, being told, contain your emotions, you know, treat sex like an athletic event. You know, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it opens up, and it's also scary as hell. Both things are true, and that's just the reality. I know I'm talking a lot, but your questions are making me think of so many things. One of which is, when I've talked to young men also who say, I don't know how to quit, I don't know how to do this. And my only response is, listen, there's no template that works for everybody. I say, the only thing I know is that if you try to do it alone, you'll fail, right? If you try to get yourself out of that spiral, downward spiral of your pornography use, and you're too afraid to talk to anybody else about it, you won't be able to do it. This is something we have to do together. And sometimes the women in our lives are very helpful, but we have to also, you know, in male-only space, be able to talk to each other. We have to be able to look each other and be vulnerable and deal with that fear. And so anybody who's listening and says, I don't think I can do this, you can do it if you have at least one friend you can talk to about it. That's all it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you touched on there, and I don't know if we'll be able to capture it today, but I'm very much fascinated in this notion of manufactured desire and how much porn obviously plays into that. And as you said, with junk food, it's the same. It's like needing to kind of reboot your palate. And that was obviously, we were talking about taste, and I'm thinking, you know, also our imaginations when it comes to sex and sexuality is a need to actually step back and deconstruct it, because of my previous interest in propaganda. As I look at pornography as a type of propaganda in terms of the messaging it embeds in us. And
let me tell a story about that will allow everybody who's younger than me, which is probably 99.9% of the people listening, to get a little chuckle. The first research I did on pornography involving interviews with male porn users, I was talking to a man who said exactly what you were articulating. except he learned about it not by, going on the internet. This was before the internet. In those days, you could buy discount packs of pornographic magazines in which there might be 5 in a pack, but you could only see the cover of the one on top because they were shrink wrapped. And he said, I'd buy those packs and I'd get home and there would be a magazine that had something really deviant. Again, I don't want to go into details. It's not appropriate. And he said, I never wanted to see that. I didn't go into that porn store looking to buy that. But he said, there it was sitting on my table. And he said, I looked at it and all of a sudden I started to like it. And I started to develop a desire for that.
Yep.
We know in everyday life that advertising can affect our attitudes and our behaviors. It can shape our desires. You mentioned fast food again, that, the fast food industry pours billions of dollars into advertising to shape those desires. Why would we think somehow sex is immune from that? Of course it does. And pornography is as you put it very appropriately, the primary propaganda vehicle for shaping the way we think about men, women, sex, power, the whole thing. And there's no way around that. That is simply a reality we have to deal with.
Touching on that and thinking back that it's been 14 years since you wrote Getting Off, how do you see pornography having changed in that time? I know you haven't done as detailed study, but what have you read? What do you understand in terms of where we've gone from even 14 years ago?
Yeah, this is where it gets really dark. My friend Gail Dines and I, who have worked together for 30 years now, we often say, we just had this conversation the other day, that Andrea Dworkin, this woman I will cite often because her work was so important, when she wrote her first book on pornography, it was published in 1979, she was looking at mainly pornographic magazines from the Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler era. By comparison to what's on the internet today, that stuff is pretty tame, right? Andrea saw deeply into the dynamic of pornography, that male dominance, the way men get pleasure from seeing women degraded. She saw deeply into that at a time when the material was far less extreme. And she called it, she understood that. And in some sense, she was saying, listen, if we don't stop this, this is going to go in a direction that it exactly has gone. She was right. I mean, Andrea Dworkin was brilliant in her ability to see where this would go. Yeah. And where it's gone, of course, is not just into female nudity for a primarily heterosexual male audience or straightforward sex on camera. It's gone into the deeply degrading and often violent depiction of men achieving sexual pleasure at the expense of women's dignity. I do keep up by reading other research and talking to people who still do research on it. And the pattern is quite clear that as men get satiated, as you get used to a certain level of sexual intensity, the only place the industry can go to continue to keep you hooked on the material is to increase the intensity. And the intensity they increase is about male power, male dominance, and violence. And it has led to a place that I don't even think Andrea Dworkin could have imagined. As I said, she died almost a decade ago now, and I think she would be shocked. It's impossible not to look at modern internet pornography, no matter how jaded you are, no matter how much you know about the world. I think it's impossible to look at it and not be shocked at what one human being can do to another.
I agree.
Purely out of pleasure. And of course, it's almost always men doing to women for male pleasure.
Yeah.
And it scares people. And I think part of the reason people have such a hard time talking about it, part of the reason parents have a hard time talking to their children about it, part of the reason teachers don't know how to talk about it often, is because it's scary. Right? It's scary what we have come to in this culture.
Because I think, what does it say about us? That's the fun thing that I find confronting is it's like, what does it say about us, in particular about us men,
Yeah.
And I find that very confronting.
Yeah, I don't want to overdraw the comparison, but if we look back at American history and the institution of slavery, we say, how could, white plantation owners, slave owners, have put their own pleasure, their own wealth and power and comfort over the abject suffering, the misery of so many people who were enslaved. And we can see that now. We can see it clearly, that privileging of your own comfort over the humanity of another person is simply morally unacceptable. That is an apt description of the pornography industry, right? I often use this interview as an example. As I said, I went to the pornography industry convention in Las Vegas for several years to interview porn producers. And one of them, I would ask them, well, what are the changes? What are the trends? What's going on in the industry? And one guy said to me, he said, it's harder to have a stable relationship with a woman in pornography as a director. He said in the old days, you would use a woman, actually they call them girls. In the porn industry, as a side note, every woman is a girl, no matter how old. They call them porn girls. And he said, you'd shoot a girl in a scene and call her up a month later and use her in another scene, and 6 months later. He said, now you use a girl, and if you call her a month later, she might not even be there anymore. He said, this is an industry that chews up and spits out women at a pretty alarming rate. He said the sexual acts we now expect women to perform, things like multiple penetrations, where women's bodies are really subjected to an incredible level of abuse. He said those are hard. And he said a lot of women can't take it. And he said, it's a steady parade of younger women who come into the industry and then are psychologically or physically or both so injured that they have to leave. And of course, their lives are then forever marked by that trauma. That's the reality of the porn industry. And when men use pornography, you cannot know the conditions under which that pornography was made.
That's right.
You can't read a smiling woman's face in a porn video to mean that woman was happy, right? And so every time, and I say this bluntly because I want men to think about it, every time you use a pornographic video for your own sexual pleasure, you are using a product produced by an industry that chews up and spits out women, that leaves women psychologically and physically injured, and you are morally connected to that. That is your responsibility. And I think once you think about it that way, it's harder to find pleasure in those videos.
I agree. That's just so hard to hear again, Robert. And none of what you've said I haven't read before or listened to someone say, but I think just time and time again, it's so hard to hear that. And I know when I speak to audiences, I recognize that, if we consume this stuff, we are patrons of that industry. We are fueling this, we are increasing the demand for it. And that's hard. And people don't want that to sit on their conscience, to sit on them as a moral duty that they have towards the other. But for me, that is the reality. And encouraging, and Melinda shares of this often, is that there are more young men recognizing their connection to that, injustice, and recognizing as a result why they must quit, and do all that they can to resist and help others resist.
That, we're focusing on a lot of negative realities, and that's appropriate. But here's one positive reality. When I first started doing presentations about pornography with that group, so many years ago that my friend Jim was involved in, I could pretty much guarantee that in a mixed audience with men and women, that the men would pretty uniformly be angry. Like, who are you to tell me what to do? You can't take my point. I would look out at an audience and see a lot of angry men. As time went by, that shifted. And more, as you just said, and as Melinda and you have learned in your own presentations as well, I see men who look sad, who look desperate, men who look in pain. And it's increasingly hard for those, especially younger men, to hide that. And I don't, relish people in pain, but that is a necessary journey. And that's very heartening that more and more men, especially these younger men, are saying, I know what this is doing to women and girls. I know what it's doing to me, and I want out.
That's right.
And that's the upbeat part of this story.
I agree. And if I can just add a clarification, it's like, I say all that, I know, because I'm not trying to necessarily shame someone, but because I'm
Yeah.
trying to like grab
Yeah.
and awaken some empathy and humanity in
Yeah.
them and try and provoke them in a sense to wake up from any callousness,
Yeah.
that this culture has formed in them, to
Yeah.
recognize that this isn't okay. Can
Yeah.
I ask, how do you respond to people, in particular men, that want to justify their use by saying that a woman chooses to be in pornography?
Well, in some sense, that's true. Unless a woman was, experiencing direct physical coercion, like somebody had a gun to their head, then in some sense it's appropriate to say she chose to do it. To not acknowledge that would be to, I think, reduce any woman in pornography to, kind of a machine, and that's not right. These are people with all of the capacities of other people. The question isn't, did she choose it? The question is, what are the conditions under which she chose it? And that's where you have to look at the real world experience of performing in pornography and the patterns in the history of the women in pornography. It doesn't mean that every woman has the same experience, but we can look at the research, the testimony from women who've gotten out of the porn industry, also the testimony of women who've gotten out of prostitution. Often those are similar categories. And what we find is there are patterns. Again, not 100% of the women would say this, but there are patterns in their reports about their own lives, patterns of elevated rates, disproportionately high rates of childhood sexual assault. And we know what happens when victims of childhood sexual assault, get older. They don't magically become healthy and whole. They carry the trauma of that. There are elevated rates of drug and alcohol abuse. Women in pornography don't tend to come from, rich families. Most of them don't have trust funds that they're waiting, to turn 21 so they can cash in. These are women with limited education, limited economic opportunities, and histories of violence often. Well, what does it mean to have that history and then say you chose at the age of 18 to perform in pornography? Again, I'm not saying the women are dupes, that they don't choose, but what are the conditions under which we choose? And that's not true only of pornography. That's true of all of us. We can all look at our lives and say, okay, I chose that, but what were the conditions under which I chose it? I used to, as a joke with students, say, the place to reflect on that is your experience as a student. How many of you have, done a stupid assignment for a stupid professor, not because you chose to do it, but because you'd flunk the class if you didn't? And how many of you, did all sorts of things because you lacked the power to control your own destiny in that moment? I mean, this is just, basic sociology. It's basic, life. Everybody's had the experience of knowing, oh, I chose that, but I chose under really constrained conditions, or I chose without a self-awareness of what I was choosing.
Yeah.
I made a lot of choices as a young person that I thought I was freely choosing, that I go look back and I can see all of the influences that distorted my capacity to choose in my own self-interest.
That's right. And the other things that I've noted, and you'd be more across the research than I, is like how many young women have entered prostitution, in particular, and pornography, before they were even 18. That they were groomed from it from a young age.
Yeah.
The other things that I've seen is, like porn producers not actually revealing what would happen, what would occur, and until it's too late, and young women who are mainstream pornographers, who, if they've ever spoken out because they were abused or sexually assaulted on a set, they lose their work. And again, so what kind of choice do you have if you will lose your potential only income if you ever speak out or highlight any of the cruelty and injustices? So from what I've heard is like everything is actually stacked against them to escape it, or to fully know what even occurs before they enter in. And it is like an ambush, and then it's grooming and control from then on.
That's very routine. Everything you just articulated is well documented in the research literature, as well as in the testimony of women who typically have left the porn industry. It's a choice only in the most sort of degraded sense.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we should remember that women who are in the sex industry, whether it's pornography, prostitution, stripping, often tell a very different story after they left the industry. I use the example of a friend of mine who, when she was in college, danced in strip clubs. And she said, if you had met me back then and asked me, well, why are you stripping? I would have said, well, it's because I'm in control of my own body and my sexuality, and I'm making money, and I'm the one who controls the men in this club. And this is all about empowerment. She said, I would have told you that. She said, what I wouldn't have been able to tell you at that point is that I was drunk or high every time I was on stage, and that I had yet to deal with and resolve some of the issues around my history of being a victim of childhood sexual assault. She said I hadn't processed any of that. So what is the truth about her experience? The story she told when she was, dancing on stage, or the truth she came to understand later when she had the time and the space to reflect on a history of violence and a history of drug and alcohol abuse? Well, if we want to talk about the choices women make in porn, that's where we have to start.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I want to emphasize is the people who really do have choices are us, the men who use porn or go to women in prostitution. We're the ones who are making a relatively free choice.
That's right.
And we have the ability to say, no, we won't participate in the systematic degradation of girls and women. That's a choice that we struggle with. And I'm not saying it's easy in every moment to make, but it's a choice that's much clearer, and in which we have much more control over our own actions than the women in these industries.
Yep. To touch on another argument and another pushback that we often face is this notion of ethical porn.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Because in my mind, I think it's PR spin from the industry without any kind of conception of what even constitutes ethical porn and any capacity to prove it, even if you could imagine it.
Well, I think there are a couple of things to say. One is, of course, if there is going to be sexually explicit material, it would be better if it was made without coercion, without violence, without deception, without the routine degradation and abuse of women. That's all true. But is that the world we're trying to create? A world in which our sexuality is still tied to masturbation, to an image on a screen? Here, I think, people can differ in their opinion, but I'll just speak for myself. Sexuality is obviously an important part of human existence. I mean, even people who are not sexually active have sexuality. So it's central to our lives, obviously. But what is it? Well, it's kind of a mystery. It's a powerful force in our lives. The older I've gotten, the more I've come to see that the real beauty of sexuality is in being vulnerable, right? In being vulnerable in front of another person, in opening yourself up through the experience of pleasure so that another person can see you. It's really powerful. I don't want to be, this isn't some, overly romantic Hollywood version. I'm talking about the real experience of being in the presence of another person you love and feeling that. You feel seen in a new way. It's incredible, right? It doesn't happen with every sexual experience, but to me, that's the goal.
Yep.
That is impossible to experience with pornography because you're not interacting with another person. Right?
Right.
It's impossible to experience in prostitution because you're not interacting with a person who's being honest in front of you. You're interacting with someone who is presenting herself in a way to get your money, right? And that's very clear. If you're in a strip club, you are not experiencing sexuality with a person who sees you and whom you see honestly. So for me, even if there was such a thing as ethical porn or feminist porn, and it was made under the best conditions, my question is, why would I want it?
That's right.
Why would I want to experience sexuality through a screen? Now, I watch movies, and I'm not against screens as a form of storytelling. There's nothing really as much fun sometimes as seeing a movie that takes you to a new place and tells you a story you never thought about. But I think sexual expression is a little different, and I don't think we're going to find what we're looking for through screens. Now, that's for me. Other people may have a different experience, but I think in the end, when your sexuality is tied to an image on a screen, there is no way for that to be fulfilling in any really meaningful way.
And I think for mine, it still also confirms all of the consequences of looking at any person who is objectified and dehumanized, even in those conditions, because of the mediation of a screen, in the mediation of it being sold parts, you know, and titillation. And so I look at all the research that even just looks at how objectification in those that behold it have a diminished view of women's morality, competency, and humanity. And I feel like you can never get away from that as soon as you reduce a woman's body to that in whatever conditions.
Yeah. So, can I say one more thing? You're making me think of so much of my own history too. So I was a very short, skinny, effeminate kid. I was a late bloomer. I was always the shortest kid in my class, the skinniest kid in my class. I was about as far away from the image of, you know, the young male stud as you could imagine. My sexual experiences came later than most of my peers. They were awkward. I was scared. I didn't know how to be a sexual person. And I look back on that with fondness because that's part of how I learned about myself. And that's very different than your first sexual experiences coming from masturbating on a screen where you almost see this very distorted how-to manual about sex that bears no resemblance to real world sex. And so I think sometimes men, especially young men who were kind of nerdy, and that's me, it's easy to take refuge in pornography because it's not so scary. There's no risk
or vulnerability.
Yeah, and that's exactly the reason not to do it, because we don't learn about ourselves, we don't grow, we don't become mature sexual beings if we don't go through that awkwardness. Yeah. And you know, mine was particularly awkward because I was particularly nerdy. But I think that's true of almost all of us. You know, none of us, go into our first sexual encounters, with a real understanding of what we're doing. And it's kind of the naivete and the exploration with another young person who's equally naive. But you got to get free of all that stuff about, male dominance and male power, or you can't access that.
I'm going to quote you here, one of your famous lines, and I love you to comment on it, that pornography is what the end of the world looks like.
Yeah. That's one of those hard ones because it's kind of glib and people think of it as a good way to shock people, but it's literally true for me that when I mentioned the research I did for the book Getting Off was really difficult. And by the end of that, I had seen enough images of male pleasure tied to female degradation. I'd seen enough of the eroticizing of violence that I thought, this is what happens when people cannot see the humanity of another person. And the inability to see the humanity of another person is kind of what the end of the world is going to look like.
Yep.
And so even though it's a snappy line, I know, every time I hear it, I feel a kind of despair about the place I was in when I wrote that line. I'm not in that place anymore. Again, that's the good news. When we realize this, we don't have to be stuck in it. We can start to construct a new way of living, a new way of seeing the world. But that was meant, honestly, that if you glimpse at pornography deeply into the end of empathy, which is what pornography really is, it's the end of men's ability to empathize with women as people. That doesn't end well for anybody.
So with that, and correct me if I'm wrong, given I'm trying to represent you here, I sense so much of your influence from James Baldwin in terms of having to confront the reality of a particular evil, an ill, a darkness in society, if we're going to actually do anything about it. Because as he says, then you know what hits you if you run towards it.
Yeah.
And is that kind of what's influenced that? And I don't want to camp there, because I
Yeah.
actually want to use that as a springboard to then say, so what is it that we should be offering young men in terms of how do we encourage them? What is it that we should be modeling or shaping them or saying to them to resist pornography, and in a sense, as this series is termed, to reimagine, masculinity, to hope for something better for themselves?
Well, one very blunt way to put it is to say the world's been lying to you. The dominant culture, a lot of the men in your life, often well-intentioned men, maybe coaches, fathers, uncles, who knows, have been telling you to become something that, if you do become that, a man who is obsessed with control, conquest, domination, a man who sees his identity as being inexorably tied to power. If you accept that and build your life to achieve that, you will not only cause harm in the world, you will not only be part of a system that routinely, visits these injuries upon women and girls, but you will be miserable. You will be a miserable person, in both sense. You'll be creating misery for others, and you will never be fully human. You will never feel at peace with yourself. I talked about my own experience as a very non-traditional man, somebody who wasn't, who didn't measure up to the ideal of the tough guy. But even though I never could be that, I tried to be. Right? I thought that's what I was supposed to do. Once I grew up, I got a little bigger, a little older. I thought, oh, this is how I'm going to be happy. And I spent basically my 20s trying to be something that I didn't want to be, that I never really was, that the world told me to be. And it wasn't until feminists sort of liberated me from that I could start to ask, well, who are you really? And that's what I would say to young men. You're never going to know who you are if you're trapped in trying to be the tough guy, right? And it's not a theoretical exercise. It's not based on research alone. It's based on my experience. And part of that is challenging yourself and allowing yourself to be challenged by others. And part of it is being kind to yourself, because that's another thing men are not very good at if we're trained in this dominant culture. We don't know how to be kind to ourselves, to let ourselves feel, and that's a dead end. And I know where it ends up. It ends up in rage. It ends up in alcohol and drug abuse. It ends up in violence. It ends up in to say it ends up in unhappiness doesn't, it's a profound sense of disconnection from yourself. Yep. Not just, well, I'm not very happy today, but you never really know yourself. Mm-hmm. And I realize I'm going on, but the question touched something in me, that struggle that I went through and still do go through.
Yep. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I love that you started with recognizing the lie that they've been sold. Yeah. And that's again, something that Melinda and I try to do with young people in schools is show them through media literacy, like the messages that they've been sold and how that's not helping them. It's not equipping them, to flourish as young people. And in particular for, we get that young people are curious about sex. They have hormones. They're wanting to learn about this, but it's doing them a profound disservice for all the reasons we've touched on. And then for the sake of, well, what does it look like for me to flourish emotionally, mentally, relationally, with myself, with the men in my life and the women, and potentially future sexual partners. And that's the biggest thing that we're trying to get across. And for me in particular, to cultivate a vision of masculinity and manhood in them that they want to aspire to. And I know for me, I had to see it and imagine it and find new role models to look up to as to what does it look like? Because, for me, part of my story was being bullied and being ostracized because I didn't conform to, traditional visions of masculinity. And so it's like, what does it look like to then find other avenues and to encourage other young men who don't fit the mold, that there are other ways to be. And for those that may tick all the traditional molds of masculinity, is this serving you? Are you allowing yourself to open up to the other, to connect with people and wanting something so much more fulfilling for them than we're just here saying, don't watch porn, kids. It's so much more comprehensive in terms of how we want to see them thrive in this world.
And that makes reminds me to make an important point that if anybody's been watching, any man's been watching this who's gay and says, well, this doesn't have anything to do with me, this is about heterosexuality. I think your point is well taken, that this isn't about straight or gay. This is about how we are socialized as men. And in the gay world, you will find some of the same problems of dominance, of sexual pleasure tied to domination, to violence. Nobody escapes this. We've been talking in a primarily heterosexual context about heterosexual porn, but gay pornography replicates some of these same problems. And the other point you made is really important, that even the guy that you think has got it all together, who's the perfect man, I can guarantee you at some point in that man's life, he has wondered, am I really man enough? Because we're never secure in a society like this. We can never say we're okay, we're enough. Even the biggest stud, in America, it would be the high school football quarterback, football the way we play it.
Yeah.
The way God intended football to be played. And I knew some of those guys, and I can guarantee you that if I could go back to some of them, they would say, yeah, there were times when I thought I wasn't man enough, because this kind of masculinity breeds insecurity in all of us. And that is no path to a decent society, and it's no path to individual happiness either.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Robert. Gosh, I know we could talk forever. I'm wondering if we should wrap it up here for your sake and for the listeners dialing in with us. I do want to thank you so much. I want to thank you for your work, your ongoing legacy, and how you've made yourself available not only to myself, but the team and just so many other young people who are wanting to rethink these issues. So I just want to thank you and honor you whilst I have this moment and an online audience listening in. So yeah, thank you so much, Robert.
Well, I appreciate that, but I do want to also kind of reflect it back. Collective Shout is an incredible organization. I've made one trip to Australia where I got to meet Melinda, and I've only met you now online, but the work you all are doing is really important and really inspiring. And it speaks to, if you try to do this alone, you will fail. If we do it together, there's hope. And so I just want to say thanks. And I'm a big fan of Collective Shout. I wish there were a Collective Shout US. So maybe we need to franchise you all into the United States. We surely need it.
Sounds good. Looking forward to coming back there one day. But thank you
great.
so much, Robert.
Thank you, Daniel. Good night.